The unforgiving Arizona sun, a constant presence in the town of Red Rock, beat down on the cracked asphalt. Sarah, a woman in her late 20s with a quiet strength etched into her features, navigated the familiar streets. Her life, a delicate balance of routine and resilience, revolved around her 7-year-old daughter Lily and her job as a waitress at the Rusty Spoon, a local diner where the coffee was strong and the gossip was stronger. Their small house, with its sun-faded paint and a yard full of tenacious desert weeds, sat close enough to the military base that the distant thuds of training exercises were just a part of the daily rhythm. One sweltering Tuesday, as Sarah was driving home with Lily humming a cheerful, tuneless melody in the passenger seat, the world changed. The air, usually thick and still, was suddenly rent by a sound so violent and all-consuming that it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't the bass-heavy boom of a C4 detonation. This was a deep, guttural roar that shook the very ground. In the rearview mirror, Sarah saw the car behind her lurch. Lily's humming stopped abruptly, her small face frozen with fear. "Mommy, what was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden blare of car alarms. Sarah's gaze shot to the horizon. A column of thick, black smoke, angry and immense, was blossoming from the direction of the military base, a sinister mushroom cloud against the pale blue sky. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Instinct, raw and primal, took over. "Lily, stay here. I mean it. Do not leave the car," she commanded, her voice strained but firm. She grabbed her tattered but always prepared emergency kit from the glove compartment and threw open the car door. The air was now heavy with the acrid smell of burning materials and something else, something metallic and sharp. Running toward the perimeter fence of the base, she saw a chaotic scene. Debris, large and small, rained down from the sky. The ground trembled with a series of smaller, secondary explosions, each one sending a new wave of fear through her. Amid the swirling dust and panicked shouts, she saw him, a young soldier, barely out of his teens. His uniform was torn, his face pale and streaked with blood from a jagged cut on his forehead. He stumbled away from what was once a barracks, his movements clumsy and disoriented. His arm hung limp at his side, and he was clearly in shock. Another sound, a low, menacing hum, began to build in the air. Sarah's gut clenched. She knew that sound. It was the precursor to a major blast. Time seemed to slow. There was no time to think, only to act. In a desperate, split-second decision, she launched herself toward the young man, tackling him to the ground just as the next deafening explosion ripped through the air. She threw her body over his, sheltering him with her own against the concrete wall of a fortified bunker. A wave of intense heat washed over them, a fiery breath from the mouth of hell itself. When the world stopped shaking and the ringing in her ears began to subside, she pushed herself up, her body aching from the impact. The soldier beneath her was still. For a terrifying moment she thought he was dead, but then his chest rose and fell in a shaky breath, his eyes fluttering open. They were wide with a mix of shock and gratitude. "Are you okay?" he rasped, his voice raw. Sarah, her own adrenaline-fueled terror slowly being replaced by an overwhelming relief, simply nodded. She fumbled in her kit, her hands trembling, and found a clean bandage. She pressed it firmly to the gash on his forehead, hissing softly at the sight of the wound. "We have to get you out of here," she said, her voice strained but commanding. With her help, he slowly rose to his feet, leaning on her for support. She led him through the smoke and chaos toward the main gate, where emergency vehicles were finally making their way in. As they reached the edge of the secured area, a medic rushed toward them, taking the young soldier's arm. He turned back to Sarah, his eyes locking with hers, a deep, silent promise passing between them. I owe you everything," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm Sergeant Miller. I'll find you, I promise." Sarah, exhausted and desperate to get back to Lily, offered a weak smile and a nod. She turned and ran back to her car, the memory of his wide, grateful eyes seared into her mind. In the days that followed the blast, Red Rock became a town in mourning and a town of heroes. The news was filled with stories of the brave first responders and the community members who had rushed to help. Sarah's story, a small but powerful act of heroism, spread like wildfire. She was hailed as a local hero, a title she wore with a quiet discomfort. People she barely knew would stop her at the diner or at the grocery store, offering thanks and praise. She would smile politely and brush it off, her mind consumed not by the praise, but by the face of the young soldier she had saved. His promise, "I'll find you," echoed in her mind, a constant refrain. She found herself scanning faces in the crowd, looking for a young man with a slight limp and a faint scar on his forehead. Lily, ever perceptive, noticed her mother's distraction. "Mommy, are you sad?" she asked one night, her small hand tracing a line on Sarah's cheek. Sarah would hug her daughter tight, her voice thick with emotion. "No, sweetie, I'm just thinking." But the truth was, she was worried. Sergeant Miller hadn't found her. What if he was hurt worse than she thought? What if he couldn't remember her? What if he was gone? A quiet desperation began to settle in. She couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility, of a profound and unspoken connection forged in a moment of terror. She had to find him. She felt a need for closure, a need to know that the young man she had shielded with her own body was safe. So she began her own personal search. She went to the military base, but was politely turned away by guards citing security concerns. She visited the local military family support group, describing the soldier's face and the specific location of the barracks he had stumbled from. Nobody recognized her description. The community was large, and the turnover of personnel was constant. She felt like she was chasing a ghost, a promise that had been lost in the smoke and chaos. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift at the diner, Sarah was wiping down the counter, her mind miles away. Mr. Peterson, a gruff but kind old man who had been coming to the diner for years, sat at his usual stool, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. He looked at her with a gentle, knowing look. "You're a good woman, Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What you did, that took real courage." Sarah sighed, a tired sound that was more of a confession than a response. "I just hope he's okay, Mr. Peterson. I don't even know his last name." Mr. Peterson took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze thoughtful. "Sergeant Miller, you say? The new fella?" He paused, thinking. "I heard my son. He's in the same unit, talking about him. Said he was a new recruit. Got a real bad scare, but he was getting transferred for medical treatment, far as I know." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. "Do you know where?" she asked, her voice a little too loud. Mr. Peterson shook his head slowly. "No, but I know his sister, a young girl, works at the library. Emily, I think her name is." A fierce, undeniable wave of hope crashed over Sarah. She quickly finished her duties, her hands working on autopilot as her mind raced. The library was just a few blocks away. She knew it was late, but she had to try. She drove through the quiet streets, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. When she arrived, the library was closed, but a young woman was locking the front door, her head bowed in concentration. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, her voice filled with an urgency she couldn't hide. The woman, startled, looked up. "I'm looking for Sergeant Miller's sister. Are you Emily?" The woman's eyes, wide with surprise, met hers. "Yes, I am. Do I know you?" Sarah, her breath catching in her throat, began to recount the story, the words tumbling out in a rush of emotion. She told her about the blast, the smoke, and the young soldier with the bloody forehead. She described the moment she shielded him and the promise he had made. As she spoke, Emily's face transformed. The initial confusion melted into a look of dawning recognition, and her eyes welled up with tears. "My brother, Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He told me he was saved by an angel. He's been looking for you too." Emily led Sarah to the local hospital, the old building smelling of antiseptic and quiet sorrow. The corridors were long and hushed, the only sound the soft hum of hospital equipment and the occasional hurried footstep. Michael was in a semi-private room, a small window overlooking a manicured courtyard. He was sitting up in bed, a book open on his lap, but his gaze was fixed on the distant horizon, a profound sadness in his eyes. He looked tired and a little lost, a far cry from the disoriented but determined young man Sarah had last seen. When Sarah walked in, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the room. A flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of shock and disbelief, washed over his face. He slowly lowered the book, his hands trembling slightly. "It's you," he whispered, his voice thin with emotion. Sarah's own eyes welled up, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I promised I'd find you," she said, her voice catching on a sob. Michael's own tears began to fall. "I tried," he said, his voice raw with a mix of relief and regret. "I asked everyone. I didn't know your name. I thought I'd never get to thank you properly. I've been feeling so lost." Sarah moved closer to the bed, taking his hand, a gesture of comfort that felt as natural as breathing. "You're safe now," she said softly. "That's all that matters." As she sat there, she noticed a small, framed photo on his nightstand. It was an old, slightly faded picture of a woman with a wide, infectious smile and long, dark hair. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. The woman in the photo, she knew that face. Next to it was a more recent photo, a man in a military uniform, a familiar smile on his face. Her heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm of recognition. It was her brother, James. Tears, hot and fast, began to fall from Sarah's eyes, a torrent of grief and understanding. Michael looked from the photos to her, a confused look on his face. "That's my sister, Amy," he said, pointing to the faded photo. "She passed away a long time ago. She was a medic in the army, a real hero. She saved so many lives." The words were a bell tolling in Sarah's memory. Amy, the girl her mother had talked about, the best friend who had joined the army to escape a life of poverty, only to be killed in a tragic training accident. Her mother had mourned her fiercely, a profound loss that had shadowed their lives for years. Michael then pointed to the photo of her brother, his expression filled with reverence. "And this is your brother, Sergeant James." He paused, a sob escaping him. "He was my sergeant, my mentor, the best soldier I ever knew. He saved my life once, during an ambush in Afghanistan. He took a bullet for me." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, a sudden, brutal, and beautiful truth. "He told me something I'll never forget," Michael continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He said that when you risk your life for someone, you make a promise to them, a promise to live and to find a way to thank them. He said a true soldier, a true hero, never forgets." In that moment, everything clicked into place. The overwhelming connection she had felt, the desperate need to find him. It wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was fate, a debt being paid. James, in his own way, had sent her a hero to save, a life to protect, a promise to keep. The man she shielded with her body was a man her brother had shielded with his. Their meeting was not a coincidence, but a beautiful and heartbreaking completion of a circle of heroism and sacrifice. As Sarah sat there holding Michael's hand, She realized the tears weren't just for the relief of finding him, but for the profound, almost mystical irony of it all. The broken promise of a soldier who had tried to find her was now a bridge to an unbroken bond, a connection to a brother she had lost and a mother she had loved. It was a new chapter, a testament to the enduring power of human kindness and the legacy of heroism that lives on long after the heroes themselves are gone.